The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zero Books podcast. Alex Hochuli is a writer and research consultant based in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He has bylines in Jacobin, The Baffler, NBC, The Brazilian Report, and other publications where he writes on global and Brazilian politics, as well as film and urbanism. He is the editor and co-host of the Global Politics podcast, Off of Bunga Bunga, and he's a co-author, along with George Hoare and Philip Cunliffe, of the upcoming book, The End of History. Alex, welcome back to the Zero Books channel.
Thank you. I'm glad to be back.
Yeah, so I was looking at your book again, The End of History, and I tell you something. The last time we spoke, your book resonated with me intellectually, but today I'm feeling the burn out. I am looking around at the left and my own life and feeling as though I'm sort of spent, and the end of history doesn't feel as optimistic as I might have expected. And reading your introduction again to the book, it doesn't seem like you were feeling particularly optimistic either when you wrote about, let's say, the failure of the Corbyn and Sanders campaigns in the U.S. and UK. So I'm just wondering, how are you feeling? Are you feeling burned out lately, or do you feel more optimistic than I do?
Well, I mean, because I'm not in Brazil at the moment, that already puts my optimism a little bit higher than it was previously. But I think, I mean, you're right that if the book had been written in 2018-19, I think it would maybe have a different complexion, because it would be talking about what is the possibility, perhaps, that Sanders and Corbyn primarily, but not only, would be able to take their projects to the next level, which obviously wasn't the case. And when we wrote it, it was very obvious that already Corbyn had failed and Sanders, it was still up in the air. And I think as we were putting the finishing touches on the book, Sanders dropped out of the race in the US. And already, I think, I mean, certainly closer watchers of US politics than myself would attest to the fact that it probably didn't have that same populist energy in 2020 as it did in 2015-16. So that is definitely, I think we can say that coronavirus, although a sort of random event, I guess, something completely unexpected and exogenous, it was something that, despite those factors, was something that kind of put paid to, or at least was coincidental with the ending of left populism, and in maybe in a way putting the kind of closure on the populist decade. Because I think it would be remiss of us to ignore the fact that the 2020s was a populist decade. Certainly in Europe, maybe not so much in the US, but across Europe, it was a constant concern from
the 2010s, not the 2020s. We're still just beginning the 2020s.
Yes, that's right. Did I say 2020s? I meant the 2010s. Yeah. If I said the wrong thing, no. So I'm living in the future. I'm talking about
what? 2030 already, is it? Oh my God.
Yeah, no, that's depressing. No, the 2010s was a populist decade. And I think a lot of what we're seeing now is in some ways, maybe even a response to a lot of kind of populist upsurges that happened across the decade.
So this is something I wanted to ask you about, is why you characterized Corbyn and Sanders as representing a left populism rather than some kind of socialist movement.
I think primarily because they depart from a traditional socialist understanding, which is rooted in the working class as the primary agent, the primary subject of that sort of politics. They try to appeal to different groups. They try to pull together a coalition, which includes sections of the middle class, perhaps more downwardly mobile middle class, which I think lots of people would argue are the primary kind of ended up the primary spokespeople for that. And you can look and you can see that through key policies around education, for example, around high access to higher education, which I think by necessity ends up being something that appeals primarily to middle class or middle class aspirants. So not to say that it's a bad policy, but I think we have to look at it as, you know, as what it is.
Okay.
But also,
So
yeah,
I want to jump in right there. So I just recently read an essay from 1946 about neurosis and the reasons why middle class children, male children particularly, were likely to be neurotic. And again, this is from 1946. It talked about the difference between like an immigrant working class family and a middle class family, and why the middle class family would be more likely to produce a neurotic child. But for me, the key to that, reading that essay, was to not consider working class and middle class as economic categories, but as social categories.
mm-hmm.
And that also meant that big sections of what is the working class would be living in the conditions that in 1946 were described as middle class today.
Yeah.
So, you know, in a nuclear family, cut off from a community, not doing domestic work that participated in a larger community. So for instance, women who were middle class had domestic work to do, but they had less of it, but it was also less productive in a communal sense.
Yeah.
And less socially rewarding for that reason. And I would say that most of the American working class today is living in those kinds of conditions, in middle class kind of conditions, where, you know, the dream is to be have a career, to be successful as an individual, even for working class people.
Absolutely. No, I don't disagree with that. I think what I'm drawing attention to is firstly that they may be workers, right? And might be people who have nothing to sell but their labor, but they also might be, in very many cases, people with university degrees, which gives them a certain sort of assets which they can leverage. And perhaps also come from middle class families with, you know, home ownership. Again, that might mean that you see them only as the upper end of the working class, the very top end of the working class, but nevertheless, that's what they are. Others are kind of independent professionals who maybe have a more ambiguous position with regard to what would be traditionally considered the working class. And I don't mean, you know, just industrial working class. I mean, you know, include the service sector in that as well. But the point being is that I think it's with respect to the politics of it, is that even just examining it in terms of retail politics, things like access to higher education, while that might appeal to the whole or a large swathe of the working class who might aspire to be able to go to college and get the kind of career advancement that was meant to provide. And of course, the telling thing, of course, is that it doesn't provide that. If people were missold the idea of social ascension through higher education, because there's just not enough kind of professional jobs to mop up that or to absorb all those people with degrees, which is, of course, the thing we've seen across Europe and North America over the past, probably about 8 or 9 years. But, you know, it's telling that they were talking about canceling student debt in the US, but not, you know, payday loan debts, for example, which is something which probably bears more heavily and more immediately on swathes of the working class. Anyway, that's not to say, you know, the point is, I think all socialist politics will always have a component of the middle class in it. I think what is telling is that for a lot of that, with the withering of working class organizations, trade unions, and so on, that these movements became perhaps more dominated by the middle class, by better off workers or by independent professionals and so on.
Well, on the payday loan versus student loan debt question, it's obvious to me that the payday loan scheme is operative because of the basically low wages. You know,
Yeah.
that the way to address, I mean, I think the argument would be you address the payday loan problem. First of all, you might regulate the hell out of those lenders, right? But also So like they can't charge as much for being late on repayment, because what you get one of these payday loans and you'll end up owing like 10 times what you borrowed if you're not careful. So they could stamp down on that. And I think there were some proposals along those lines, but that's not very sexy. What's sexy is educational loan forgiveness, because that might address the underlying problem of low wages. At least that's what people would think, right? That if you get an education, then you can demand a higher wage, and if you don't have to, if there's less of a barrier to education and more freedom.
I think everybody should have access to higher education. So I think it's I think it's a fine policy.
I'm just pointing out that it's not a moral question. It's just like, are we still, what is addressing the concerns of the working class is the question. And I think payday loans seem obviously to address it, but most people who are taking payday loans really want a better job and better conditions. They are not looking, to have payday loan forgiveness, and then, because that will just be reproduced in a couple of months for these people.
But I mean, to bring us back, I guess, to the book, because I don't want to get into a discussion necessarily of payday loans or different policies, because I'm not creating policies here for a Sanders campaign that doesn't exist, for example. But the issue being, and I think our critique of left populism is primarily a political one, and about left populism's unwillingness to force a break with the political establishment, to still play a certain role of respectability politics, of wanting to play the kind of game. And you can see it with what happened in Greece, probably most obviously, where they had the popular backing to reject the memorandum that the European Union, the Troika, threw at them, and they were unwilling to make that break. The leadership cowed from that and effectively committed an act of treason against the Greek people, in my view, in our view, in the book. And that applies to Corbyn as well, where Corbyn was torn between his democratic sense of of upholding the referendum, and probably his own traditional Euroscepticism, and a loyalty to party members who were predominantly in favor of remaining in the EU despite having lost the referendum. And he probably maybe lacked the drive, the wherewithal. I don't know. He's not a Lenin, he was now able to make the decisive political move necessary to back the referendum result. And again, the referendum was done. It's not a very difficult thing. It might have pissed off some Labour members, absolutely. And I'm not sure it necessarily would have led to victory, but he obviously shied away from the sort of break with the European Union. One of the main important ways in which European politics is damped down, prevented from actually breaking out, the way in which democracy is kind of kept in a little container. And he didn't break with that, despite the fact that a majority of British people had voted for it. So I think those are just two examples which kind of get to the nub of what our critique of left populism was, which was its political lack of willingness to break with the establishment.
Well, in the case of Syriza, it's interesting because in order to successfully challenge the European Union, I think they would have needed to have a coalition of nations and working people behind them, not just the will of the Greek people. Because if you go just a nationalist route, you're possibly or likely trading in one form of austerity for another, and possibly more severe form of like massive inflation.
Absolutely. And Greece would have tried to crush Greece, but that would at least have provided some semblance, some possibility, some horizon of a future. Whereas,
when you say they would have tried to crush Greece, that leaves out the reality of how capitalism functions all on its own. You don't even have to have like a German conspiracy. Yeah. You could just let the market and the international market and the value of Greek currency do what it will do.
But here's the question. Here's the question where political leadership comes in, because it's not an easy solution. I mean, it's not like hey, there's paradise here, or you can choose penury and dependence on the European Union forever. Like, which one do you choose? Okay, it's not easy. I'm not pretending that it's like a facile choice. It's saying that there's going to be a lot of short-term pain, but there's a possibility of us rebuilding our society in the future and having some sense of a future. rather than young Greeks emigrating in perpetuity up to richer Northern European countries and being beholden and weighed down by debt permanently. Or you can choose, what I've just described, being weighed down by debt permanently and having politics kind of enclosed, prevented from ever really erupting. So that's where political leadership comes in, and saying to the Greek people, listen, you voted for this. Now, let me tell you the consequences of what this is. It means a lot of hardship, but it will provide a sense of a future and create some sense of common purpose.
It will provide a nationalist project, right? That's what and a nationalist solution and some sovereignty of currency. And that's what it would have provided, a break from the European Union, the break from the disciplinary policies of the EU, and a nationalist project to try to build capital inside Greece.
But I mean, that's what's on the table. I mean, there's the idea of some cross-European simultaneous revolt, if not revolution, is something that isn't on the cards, and you have to play the cards you're dealt and make the moves. And especially when you have the whole 61% of the Greek people saying, no, screw this, we're out, or tacitly saying that, if not maybe consciously, explicitly saying it, then the cards are kind of dealt there, and I think you have to go then. It's like the problem is that the idea of waiting for a simultaneous moment across Europe where you have other countries doing the same is in some sense it's like it's waiting for Godot, really. I mean, because you're always going to be.
There were other countries like Spain that were in the similar predicament, and if there had been an international left, like an actual socialist left, organizing workers and some sort of international socialist party, there could have been a coalition of opposition.
But first you have to act. You can't wait around for the ideal conditions to develop sort of organically and wait for that to happen. In part because what is the message that the Greeks sent by that Tsipras and the Syriza leadership sent was that no, you can't really try anything because the alternative is too devastating. So you need to just kind of strum along and stay in the EU and take whatever crap they throw you. And so,
I think from the position of a British subject today, from the position of the UK, you can actually say the real lesson historically is you can take the nationalist turn, but not if you're Greece. You can do it if you're the UK. You can do it maybe if you're Germany. Germany could certainly take that nationalist turn and break up the EU. But if you're Greece, you're too weak to make that move. Right, but it will. But the rising nationalism is going to happen either way now, right? It just start with the strongest players rather than the weakest players.
Yeah, but I mean, I think part of the problem is I think the fact that the left has largely ran away from the nation state, and not in a sense of some kind of advance on the limitations of nationalism towards some sort of internationalism. It's either a sort of fantasy cosmopolitanism where you think that you're going to get together with comrades from across the world, but really it's just a couple of intellectuals in different countries chatting, which is cool, good.
Right. No,
Let's, we can do that. But the point is,
don't knock my hobbies, man. I mean, I enjoy that shit. But go ahead.
But likewise. But we have to be realistic about what that is, and or a retreat into localism or into small scale little initiatives and so on. And so there has to be, and it's in the Communist Manifesto even, trying the working class becoming effectively the nation, and the retreat from the nation state, even if we don't think that's the ideal form of politics and we're internationalists and so on, I think it needs to start there. And it needs to start there because the nation state has been the only container for some semblance of democracy and working class advancement that's ever been. And a kind of stepping away from that and going, no, well, we don't want to get involved in any nationalism, ends up just being a retreat from the terrain of politics itself.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think we've landed on a point of disagreement, although I don't have an internationalist project that I can say, look, we could do this instead. You're right. But I feel as though, it's a flip of a coin whether or not a neoliberal internationalist politics is going to lead to socialism more effectively than a bunch of nationalist projects, especially amongst the most developed nations, will lead to
I-
socialism. You
So,
know,
so I mean, just one thing on this is that, and this is kind of I guess, a sub theme of the book, or sort of motif about that runs through it. That the end of history takes as an assumption that there was an actual end of history, and the kind of nucleus of that is the historical defeat of the working class at the end of the 1980s, and that was a global phenomenon, and that is in some sense our starting point. And I think if you ignore that, or try to evade that, or try to think like, yeah, but it was merely a political defeat and there'll be a new cycle or whatever, I think not coming to terms with what an epochal break that was, would leave you in the wrong place, and leave you kind of trying to seek out solutions which appeal back to the past, or old forms of doing politics, which are no longer relevant because the conditions are just radically different. We don't live in an age of mass politics anymore, and I think that's something that we have to start with. That's your starting point. You have to grapple with that. If you don't, then you're assuming that there can be some sort of big internationalist movement which will appear out of nowhere, and with that in mind, the end of history presents an opportunity in the breakdown of the old order, the breakdown not just of neoliberalism, but perhaps, as we argue, the end of history period, which I guess you could see as being composed of several elements, not just kind of neoliberal economic management, but post politics, as we call it, globalism, or globalization, and so on, capitalist realism, indeed, as well. To get beyond that, and with the crumbling of the end of history period, you have the possibility for the rebirth of politics. Does that mean that it's the rebirth of the communist horizon, or whatever you want to call it? No, not not in and of itself. But I think creating the conditions for politics to emerge is important in the first step. I'm not being stagist about it. I'm not saying, oh, you do this and then next comes this. It's just we're playing the field in front of us, and the return of politics after having lived through the 90s and 2000s, and indeed a good part of the 2010s. You think, well, that's the starting point. And we see that around us, and that's the cause for hope, albeit, or optimism. Albeit the fact that it's a kind of more negative one. It's more based on the breakdown of the old, rather than something new, positively new, emerging.
I read recently a book about a book, and some sections of a book. I think it was called The End of Ideology. It was written in the 50s.
Daniel Bell.
Yeah, yeah. And there was a sense that the possibility for historic socialist change had ended as far back as when that book was written, right? The other thing is, like, the socialist project, as we understood it, as a led by the Soviet Union, let's say, and an international communist party with a real working class politics, it also it really started to disintegrate with the Hungarian Revolution and Khrushchev's speech, right? I mean, you could point to moments where what we are feeling is missing had disappeared well before this 1989 moment.
Sure.
And neoliberalism had emerged more than a decade earlier, as well. I mean, I don't disagree that Fukuyama was an important figure in terms of defining the horizons of politics, and especially America, but in that period. But I do also think that the continuity that, like pointing to people like Daniel Bell, is important to understand. Also, that there was a I would point back to 1919 as the moment where we lost working class mass politics, rather than 1989. So having said all that, what I don't disagree with a lot of what you're saying about this particular moment, nonetheless. And I wanted to ask you about, rather than being as adversarial as my kid's graduating from high school today, so I'm in a mood. But rather than being so adversarial, I'm going to ask you about the lockdowns, which is, you describe the lockdown as either coinciding with or actually causing a demobilization of the populist left. And I'm wonder how sincere or serious you are about that description. I mean, do you believe that opportunistically, maybe the coronavirus and the lockdowns are going to shift the way we are politically, like really stamp out the notion of citizenship and transform us into permanent consumers, like a la Wall-E? There's my question for you.
Well, I mean, I guess the first thing is that, I mean, in the book, I think it's an irony, right? It's an irony that left populism tries to do socialist politics without the masses. Not because it doesn't want the masses necessarily, but just because we're, again, as I said, we're in an age past mass politics, and hopefully that can reemerge in some form again. But the point is that it's just an irony, I guess, that lockdowns, which are the biggest demobilization of people, I think, in history, that emerges exactly at the same time as the defeat of left populists. So it's a quirk of history. It's a shutting of the what's the idiom I'm looking for? The door of, do coffins have doors? Whatever. It's shutting the lid of the coffin. Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
On that whole of the kind of left populist moment. As to whether it'll lead to a kind of complete change, I think that's concerning, and I think the left has been too willing to urge on the lockdowns. Now, before I even go any further, something that really gets on my nerves discussing lockdowns is that when I say lockdown, you understand an entirely different thing to what I mean. And the person listening to this is also thinking about something else because you're listening to it in different regional or national contexts. And there's a whole range of policies that could be there. And the one person listening to this saying, wait, you're against lockdown. So what, you think you should have like big gigs of like 100,000 people in a closed stadium? And, the other person understands like, oh, everyone should be put under house arrest. So anyway, there's obviously a whole range of policies. So we should be specific. Obviously, I don't have any problem with them not having big concerts on, or encouraging other methods of social distancing or whatever. Yeah, exactly. You're infecting me through the mic. I can already feel it.
I just feel the need to. Can you hear me through the mask?
Yeah.
All right, I'll take this off. I'll take it off.
I mean, look, I'm also, I should say that I don't presume to speak for my other co-authors and co-hosts of the podcast, because it's something that we've argued about consistently over the course of the past year and a half about the lockdowns, in part because also they're in a different context than in the UK, and it's not as bad as Brazil, where you had a peak of like 4,000 deaths a day. So it's a different thing. Anyway, I think wearing masks is very good and important. Indoors, everybody should wear a mask, and I think that's a small price to pay for not being locked down forever. Right?
I disagree. Like I'm vaccinated. I don't have to wear a mask.
No, I don't think you should wear a mask if you're vaccinated. I think that's crazy. No, but before the vaccinations. Anyway, without getting into the details of this, because your question obviously was about demobilization and that maybe change in citizenship. I think it is concerning. I think it's telling that some of the places with the harshest lockdowns, it's like places like Spain and France, where you had to get like a letter to leave your house or to go further than a kilometer from your house, or places with histories of fascist governments. I don't think that's purely accidental. Also places where you have to carry an ID card everywhere you go, whatever, something that, anyway. And I think it's deadly concerning. And I think the left has been too complicit with going, we're the people who care about people, not like the right. They're nasty. They don't care about you. We're the people who care, and caring means caring for your health. And therefore we should do more lockdowns, which one shows a limitation in imagination in terms of what could possibly be done about the pandemic. I don't think that lockdowns are the total horizon of what could possibly be done. In fact, they're very much a response to failure. Their failure of states to have prepared properly for a pandemic they knew was coming, and they've known was coming for at least a decade, if not more, have made plans for it, or have had some sort of planning which they then failed to hold to, and have underfunded health systems which were meant to be robust enough to be able to cope with an upsurge in cases. And that they failed to do. And I think, for one, we should be holding governments to account for those failures and for the fact that they had to do lockdowns in certain cases to prevent the health services from collapsing. So it's a product of failure. It's not a policy of like first choice, right? So there's that. And secondly, the left should be more robust in defending civil liberties. And our right to kind of engage as citizens and be free in society. under the assumption in part that, well, the authorities are locking us down, so our role is something else, not to just cheerlead further lockdowns. And I think not understanding that dynamic, and the left kind of going, well, we're the party of caring, which I think is a problem, that we care too much about being caring rather than about actually taking power and of defending freedom. And so I think that's led us into a really bad situation where the left has found itself on the wrong side of these things.
I agree with you, although I think it's important to try to distinguish between the left and the liberal mainstream. And when, like, I remember in the early 2000s, after 9/11, when I was out protesting against the war in Afghanistan early, and like I was going to little cafes filled with liberal, patrons about around my age. I was just turned 30, people in their 20s, and I got chased out of a cafe by this hippie who told me I was un-American because I was opposing the invasion of Afghanistan. And he was a liberal, and I, realized that, this was the burden I had to bear for being on the actual left and having the opinions I did about the invasion of Afghanistan. And I was out of step with the prevailing right-thinking progressive at the time who was supporting the invasion. I think that the left has to become accustomed to being in that position again.
Yeah. And not by the blackmail, because it will be blackmailed as like, you don't care enough, you're ruthless, or you're just narrowly focused on power and you don't really care about whatever protecting people, or you're unpatriotic, as the case may have it there. You're not taking terrorism seriously. You're for the terror, whatever it might be. That was a 2000s iteration. Now you have a different one today, but it's the same crap, right? It's the same sort of blackmail. And the left falls to it. I think falls for it probably too readily. They don't. It
was easier not to then, right?
I think
it's
so.
Harder now.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Because now that people, now when they say, "Oh, you're for the terrorists," they don't mean somebody who is over there who you can identify with as a victim of U.S. imperialism, but rather you're for the terrorist who might be some suburban white guy with a MAGA hat or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's a little harder now. But anyhow, go ahead.
No, I mean, I totally agree with that. And I think this is the thing about, the left proposing itself as the people who care and the people who protect people. One, that's a pretty important departure, I think, from left-wing tradition, I think, which was about seizing power, about freedom, about collectivity, and not about being a better nanny, I guess. And so, so that it's a departure from a kind of whole historical tradition, and it makes it so readily susceptible to this sort of blackmail that we've just been describing, and most, especially in kind of today's conditions, where you're meant to be, you're like any exercise of power by elites can be justified and is justified, not in terms of reference to traditional authority, morality, whatever. It's done in terms of caring for people and in terms of making your life more flexible or enjoyable or whatever. And especially now with the pandemic, about caring and protecting for people. And that seems to be the kind of coming ruling ideology. And the left will fall for it entirely and end up kind of, at best, the sort of a sort of parasitic moralizer on the back of kind of the ruling class or the kind of dominant parties, saying, actually, yes, we kind of generally agree with you, lockdowns are good, but we would actually do lockdowns in a smarter way, or we would do it in a way that made sure that it didn't harm minorities so badly, or whatever, effectively proposing minor adjustments to what is existing policy. So I think we should stop caring so much.
Yeah, I agree with you, especially now that like I said, I need to myself distinguish between the left and the mainstream progressive liberal discourse, because I run into a lot of people online who seem to believe that the more paranoid they become about germs, and the more focused they are on health, the more noble they are. Like, someone said, well, I
Mhm.
haven't gotten a cold all year, so I think I'll never end this lockdown life, because I haven't gotten the flu, I haven't
There's too
gotten the
many people who
cold.
enjoyed it too much. That's just concerning.
It really is. It's like, wow, okay, so you didn't get a cold, you also didn't see anyone, and huge amounts of people were unemployed, and you also went probably a little insane. Have you considered how insane you
Yeah.
are? um
But,
but
on the other hand, you got all this kind of authority, the social authority, which is backed up by morality and science at once. And so you can yell at people for not wearing masks or not behaving properly.
mm,
And that's a hell of a drug too. So,
yeah, I wanted to bring up something that you said earlier about how we've abandoned mass politics, and which I think mass politics would be the kind of populism that we are trying to embrace, right?
mm,
But and the reason earlier you said with socialism, the reason you wouldn't define it as socialism is because it wasn't a working class politics. And I think mass politics, we may not have abandoned it as much as we think, because I think mass politics is the politics of coalition building, is the politics of the mass as just a group of individuals rather than as a politically defined group with an aim. Like the working class had a political aim, and the masses
mhm.
don't have a political aim. Um,
But
they're
I mean,
just
oh,
Go
sorry
ahead.
to
Yeah,
interrupt, but I mean,
no,
by
go
mass
ahead.
politics, I meant something a little bit just more basic, is that people are integrated and like in the thick web of relations mediated through organizations. And that could be all sorts of things. It could be churches, if on the more conservative side of the spectrum. It can be civic associations, it can be trade unions, it can be political parties, whatever it might be social movements. But something which actually like binds people in a way which demands more commitment than just signing up to a Facebook event or turning out on the streets in this spontaneous but quite ephemeral protest moment. And so that's what I mean is that, society no longer has that thick web anymore. I mean, only elites maybe have that because they might have, the sort of kind of elite clubs where they are able to converse and maybe come to some agreement on certain things at certain times, which then get called conspiracies. But, effectively that's what happens. But, the masses no longer, we don't belong to these organizations anymore, and so that thick web of belongings and commitment leaves us, I think, increasingly. But I don't know what comes first, but put it this way, it leaves us increasingly skeptical of organizations, of even of hierarchy, because there's this idea that freedom is really basically knowing no one telling you what to do ever, right? And in a
Mhm.
political party, you'll have someone telling you what to do, or you should. Otherwise, it's not a very good political party, I think. That you have some legitimate authority, which is able to exercise coercion. And that doesn't mean beating up on people. That just means literally, you go here and do this. You're going to go and like leaflet on this street this day, just the
Mhm.
basic things of political organization. And because we've become so atomized, we're very maybe scared, skeptical of that. But there's a sort of flip side to that, and I don't personally have a straightforward answer to that. I'm just kind of gesturing at this paradox that exists today, which is that on the one hand, there seems to be a very strong desire for a sense of social purpose and for belonging, because when there are protests, people feel such a sense of elation and a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning, that you're all there together and you feel this sense of collective power. And people, you see it. You can look at images of protests from Chile, which is an extremely neoliberalized society, much more so probably than other even Latin American countries, or you can see the Gilets jaunes, or you can see whatever protests in the US that you might be familiar with. And, people very overwhelmed, I guess, emotionally sometimes by that feeling. And that's great. And it's very important. And I'm not cynical about that at all, even if I'm cynical about certain other aspects of kind of contemporary protest culture. So what you have, I guess the paradox is that there's, on the one hand, this very strongly felt need and desire for that sense of social purpose and belonging, at the same time as there's a deep skepticism of organizations and anything that binds you in, because it's very easy to opt in and opt out, and it's very low costs, right? We're not used to something where you have to opt in and you pay $5 a month or whatever it might be, and you're stuck there, and it's a commitment, which is something that not only you're held to by the organization itself, but which you hold yourself to as well, as something you're not going to let yourself just float away from because things turn out not so good, or like don't feel like it this this day, or this doesn't really satisfy what my idea of politics was this week or whatever. So as a consequence, I think, or one reflection of that thing that I'm talking about, the latter thing about skepticism towards organizations, is the feeling that anything which involves any sort of intermediary is oppressive, right? And I think this is, in one sense, a consequence of, well, the tail end of like 1968 politics, counterculture, and so on. This idea that freedom is just absolute individual sovereignty or consumer sovereignty, and that that anything which makes demands of you is inimical to freedom, and that's really problematic. And that's one of the elements which impedes the development of mass politics once again in our times today, because people are very skeptical and very scared of that.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah, go in.
Say something about freedom here. I just recently was rewatching a show called The Good Place. You ever seen this show?
I tried. I just couldn't get into it, but I've watched a couple of episodes.
Yeah, you don't have to have loved it. But in that show, there's if you're in The Good Place, you can call upon this sort of robot character who can just make things appear for you, right? So you can say, "Oh, hey, Janet, I want a Dr. Pepper, or I want a Lamborghini," and boom, there it will be. And you're actually very free in The Good Place just to get whatever you want as an individual. It turns out that people also want to have relationships with each other, and that's where the show really is about, what it's really about, and not just getting Janet to give you things. But I think the problem with that definition of freedom in the real world, of just getting the kind of objects and things that you want to consume or enjoy, is not only the fact that it's a personal enjoyment, but also that the kinds of limits and institutions and power structures that are required to create those objects are ignored, are hidden, are obscured, because in fact you don't get to go into the market freely and just consume for your personal desire. In fact, you're disciplined, and the society is disciplined into producing it in a particular way. And so the flip side of consumer society is capitalist production of commodities. And so we have to think about how the big institutions of power that exist are those productive institutions, is the workplace, whether it's in the service sector or in the factory or wherever it might be. So we actually still are completely disciplined, but we think of ourselves as free only in this limited part of our life, which is defined as leisure.
No, I think that's very good. No, that's absolutely right. I think we're completely blind to compulsion, to these other kind of more blind forms of compulsion in work, but also in the market. Though I think maybe people are maybe more aware of that, but in work, it's to a certain extent naturalized. While at the same time we're overly sensitive, perhaps, to other forms of compulsion, not just political, but just even voluntary ones, or forms of compulsion which are the necessary cost of actual voluntaristic politics, right? Of joining an organization and being wedded to it and being told, okay, today you're going to go out and leaflet on the street, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. But the other thing that I think that, in a little minute, in a few minutes, in a small minute, as opposed to a big minute, a few minutes, I want to talk about this essay that was published by EndNotes called Onward Barbarians, because some of the things we're talking about now, we should talk about then. If you have another like half an hour to 40 minutes to talk for the second part of this about that, I'd like to do it. But before we get to that, I just want to ask you the final question I'd written down for this segment, which is, given how we're looking at a future where we maybe all live underground and press buttons to have DoorDash deliver our food, and spend all of our time doing this kind of thing right now, like we're doing right now, and given the fact that we are atomized even more thoroughly than we were a year and a half ago, how do you feel about the end of history now? And is the death of this left populism, or the socialism as left populism, presenting us with opportunities at all, or are we just fucked? at this point? What do you think?
I mean, one note we put in the book actually is that it might be one of the grim consequences, kind of somewhat unforeseen, of the end of history, is that the return of politics takes the form of a reheated culture war, and a culture war which seems much more politically inflected than the culture wars of the 70s, 80s, 90s did, because they're no longer just about moral issues. It's not about, abortion, which I think it's wrong to just classify that as a purely moral issue, because it's fundamentally about freedom of the body and so on. But anyway, without getting into that, the issues today are much more political, things like immigration, for example, but they take place, or those conflicts over that occur in a completely spectacular and in some ways maybe deracinated sort of way, where you have people posing as the true defenders of the nation, as nativists and so on. And then you have the left also kind of doing this performative, open all borders right now kind of politics. And so it also takes on this form of culture war and of positioning, and I guess a narcissistic form of politics, which is more about reflecting who you are and what you want to say about yourself than about actually achieving political ends. So that's one thing. And that's, I think, probably most visible in the US, which seems particularly prey to this form of culture war, but not alone, but not only. And, I wish that I could just say, MAGA, right? Make America go away. This is just a US problem. Leave the rest of us alone. But unfortunately, that's not the case, because we see the same sort of thing. I mean, I see the same sort of thing even in Brazil, which is, rather different and doesn't have the same history as,
I just want to put
Europe or whatever.
I'm a patriot, man. Don't go knocking America.
No, that's good. You do you. Just, don't involve anyone else.
Okay. Okay. All right. Listen, I think let's just end this section here. We got 46 minutes here. People should stick around. In the Parrot Room, we'll be talking about endnotes and the culture war and all the good stuff that you pay $5 to get. Go and join us in the Parrot Room and the Patreon and all that. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.